Welcome to Bitcoin 2020. I'm your host, Greg Zellers. As promised, today's video is on gold, silver, fiat currency, and Bitcoin. It's kind of a friends and family video because I want people to understand where I'm coming from and what brought me to this point. Kind of, if I was going to rename the video, it would be why Bitcoin and why not gold, silver, and fiat currency. I'm a huge gold and silver bug. In fact, more than a bug, I'm a gold and silver freak. Gold and silver have been around since the beginning of time, and but gold particularly has been a store of value since the days of Abraham. If we look up here, and I'm not trying to throw any religion on anybody, but even if you just look at it from a historical standpoint, Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. So we see that even 3,000 plus years ago, it was important for people to have gold and silver in wealth because it was their form of wealth. It was their store of wealth. But today we use fiat currency. We use dollars. It's really just monopoly money. And at the Federal Reserve, which is not federal and holds no reserves, and I would like to reference a book called it's Jekyll Island. I'll think of it in a minute. But I want you to look at this real quick. $1 in 2017, I hope you can see that, equals 40 cents. No, I'm sorry, 4 cents in 1914, which is right after the Federal Reserve was put together, was formed. And, you know, I want you to now clearly what this means is 4 cents in 1914. No, let me rephrase that. $1 in 1914 is now actually worth 4 cents because it has devalued that much. So in reverse, $1 in 2017 was only worth in 1914 dollars was worth 4 cents. 4 cents. Now, just to prove a point, I got my driver's license in 1976, and that's kind of where my awakening in life began. So $1 in 1976, the 1976 dollar has depreciated to 22 cents today. Okay, so a 2017 dollar in 1976 is actually worth 22.394 cents. This is one that'll blow your mind. $6,000 a year in 1976. No one thinks that was a lot of money, I don't think. My guess is it was a typical wood factory job in Perry County, Indiana, perhaps. Look at this. And I switched these numbers so it made more sense to me, hopefully you too. $6,000 in 1976 is $26,000, $793.48. What that means is that it's got the same buying power. To buy as much as you could in 1976 for $6,000, it takes $26,793.48 now. I remember in 1980, I went to work for a coal company in southern Indiana, and I was running a drilling rig for them. Coolest job in the world, going out. It's like finding treasure every day. But I think I made $8.50 an hour. I made about $24,000 a year. And here's the one that'll blow your mind. $24,000 a year in 1980 is the equivalent of $79,502 in 2017. What's that tell you that's happening to our dollar? They're reducing the value of our dollar. And this is kind of what led me to where I am with gold, silver, and Bitcoin in particular. Because, as you know, our debt continues to go up every second by an unbelievable amount of money. And we owe the Chinese, Japan, Germany, and many other countries by way of legitimate government bonds. They place their currency or their money into our bonds or our federal securities. But essentially, it's us borrowing money. And so we have to pay that back. And we owe them trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Hey, before we leave that inflation calculator, I want to bring something to your attention. Let's say you made that $79,500 and whatever it was dollars a second ago, $502.97. I don't think that's the exact same number, but I think it switched numbers on me somehow. But it's really, really close. That's $79,502. In 2016 and in 2017, to have the same purchasing power, you have to have earned $80,504 in 1 year. In 1 year. So, why are they doing it? While I'm trying to load something on the screen, we'll talk about, the name of that book is The Creature from Jekyll Island, and about 1913 or thereabouts, and you can look it up. You can look up The Creature from Jekyll Island. I recommend it as a good read, a good historical read. But bankers from particularly throughout the East got on their private railroad cars and traveled to an island on the East Coast called Jekyll Island. Real place, real meeting, real people. And they kind of snuck in so no one would know about it. And they essentially formed the Federal Reserve that day, which is just great. And they called it the Federal Reserve. And so the Federal Reserve, again, is not a federal entity. And they don't hold reserves of money. They print money out of thin air. They print money out of thin air, and then they loan it to the United States government at interest. And then that's where the money comes from. And what's better than that, just a little quick side note, is that then they loan it to banks. And the banks are able to loan it out at a 10-to-1 ratio. So we get this money being inflated and inflated and inflated. But remember, we were on a gold standard, and it wasn't a perfect gold standard. It wasn't a 1-to-1, and you can look it up. It was, I don't remember what it was, but it was a gold standard where we had to have a certain amount of gold reserves to print a certain amount of money. Again, it was not a 1-to-1. And in, I want to say 1934, the U.S. government came out with this Gold Confiscation Act, and you can look it up. And please do. I don't want you to take anything that I say for granted. I want you to correct me on anything that I'm wrong, and I want you to know for yourself. But they confiscated all of the gold that was held in private holdings, individuals, and even banks, I think. I'm sure, even banks. And so, but country to country was still gold. So after World War II, we won the war. We were the big dog on the block. And we did exercise a lot of power and authority. Sometimes unrighteous, you'd say dominion. We took advantage of it, definitely. I would probably have done the same thing. But people could, if cocoa beans were being bought by the French, and I don't know where cocoa beans are made, but say they're made in, let's say it was wheat from Brazil, or corn from Brazil. Corn from Brazil, and it's going to France. the French and the Brazilians just couldn't get together and make this deal. They had to convert everything into dollars. So everything that moved country to country was done in dollars. We made sure of that, we forced that, we enforced that. And to buy the wheat, the French had to convert francs into whatever the Brazilian dollar is called. Or if it was U.S. corn, they had to convert it. Well, that's one trick conversion. So, but anyway, they had to convert it into U.S. dollars to buy the corn. And so then, and before the French, so then they took delivery of the corn. But before the Brazilians could use their money in their country, they had to convert it back to their currency. And so everything, whether it was oil, commodities, corn, soybeans, copper, cocoa beans, any commodity traded between countries was always done in dollars. Now, it's been that way since shortly after World War II. I think that was called the Bretton Woods Conference where that came down. And I'd like to make another reference to another book. In fact, I'd like to reference an author right now, and I'll get back to Bretton Woods, but his name is James Rickards. He has been contracted by the government, and I think maybe even employed as an individual, but I'm certainly contracted as a contractor advisory capacity. The guy is one of the most brilliant people I think we can find on the internet, or in print, or available to the masses to glean his brain. His books, and you might not be able to read it because it may be backward, but the first one was called Currency Wars, and it really begins talking about currency wars and the potential of that threat to the U.S. dollar. And it's a great history of the dollar and some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And then The Death of Money talks about how the dollar is being crashed. And then the third one was called The Road to Ruin. And the fourth one is called The Big Drop. And this is what he looks like. Brilliant guy, brilliant fellow. I highly recommend his books. If you don't go get his books and read them, you can go to audible.com. For certain, if you know someone who has an Audible account, they can turn you on to Audible and you can get a free book. And in fact, I do that. And so, yeah, ask me to do it perhaps, or go to audible.com. You can probably find it. But Jim talks about the Bretton Woods Conference and the things that went down there that made the dollar really king for so many years. And prior to that, the king and the real power in finance was Great Britain and the sterling. And after World War I and World War II, finally they were essentially, I won't say broke, but in a situation where we were able to take that dominant position. And so we've kept that dominant position until such time as I was talking about, gold was traded between countries. So if France was doing all this business with the United States or any other country, and they needed, or they had more dollars in their coffers than they wanted, they could essentially send a truck to the U.S. Treasury or one of the vaults the U.S. Treasury used and convert dollars to gold and ship it home, or at least convert it on paper and keep their gold in a New York vault. And that was in 1973, that was exactly the case. So all the way through from the Bretton Woods Conference to 1973, that's how things worked. And I think it was France, actually, who came knocking on the door and said, hey, we want to convert some dollars to gold. And President Nixon said, and there had been a huge run on the dollar and conversion to gold. And Nixon said, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to temporarily halt that conversion process. We'll get back to you tomorrow. That was 1974. This is 2017. It has not ever gone back into play. it's still, oh, we'll get back to you tomorrow. And now everyone realizes that we'll never get back to it because we're not going to give up the gold. So essentially, the dollar went from a gold-backed currency to most of us believed was a silver-backed currency with silver certificates back in the 50s and 60s and whatever, however far back that goes. But on a country-to-country basis, it was still a gold standard, really. And as soon as Nixon closed that door, our currency became essentially worthless. And so they had to scramble to give it some value. And so Nixon sent Henry Kissinger, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, to Saudi Arabia. The Fiat family is the ruling family of it's the patriarchal ruling family of Saudi Arabia, and they cut a deal with them. They said the OPEC nations had not been formed yet at that time, and so Kissinger said, "Look, here's the deal. We'll either come in and take over your oil fields, and we'll pay you for it, but we'll take it over and we'll control the oil. Or you can control the oil. We will provide you with our arsenal of military to keep the Mideast safe, and particularly the OPEC nations, the yet to form OPEC nations, but it was in the works. And so they formed OPEC. We protect OPEC, particularly Saudis, and suddenly the dollar isn't backed by gold anymore. It's backed literally by oil, and it's backed by the fact that, one, heretofore, the United States has been the most stable country and currency for people, whether it be countries, corporations, or wealthy individuals, to place their money for safekeeping, or gold. But as far as currencies goes, it was the U.S. dollar. And all transactions have been in U.S. dollars until recently. And I talked about that unrighteous dominion thing. And so, yeah, we've pretty well pushed our weight around on this financial side of things. And the world's getting a bit tired of it. And I'm not saying I would have done it different. All I'm saying is there's consequences to it. And so in the last 36 months, and I wish I could give you the exact date, but look it up. It's real. Russia has vast natural gas reserves. China needs tremendous amounts of natural gas to fuel its growth and its economy. Crimea is in the country that all the problems are in. And I just slipped my mind. But this pipeline goes through there, right? So anyway, so they cut this deal. And instead of going through US dollars like normal, they went directly from Chinese yuan to Russian rubles. And you understand what's missing there is that conversion into dollars. And so the US dollar has been the world reserve currency, and it has also been the world trade currency. And so all over the world, not just China and Russia, but we've had the same problem with Iran and Russia, and the same problem with many, many, many others, including our own allies. And so literally the death, one of those books, the death of money, meaning our money, is well on its way. Because without this trade thing supporting a value of the dollar worldwide, then nobody's going to want dollars. When nobody wants dollars, the real value of the dollar, remember the 4 cents, 1914? So the real value of the dollar will begin to rear its head even more. And so it blows my mind that even though these things are happening, that puts the dollar at risk, my dollar at risk, actually my hard work, because I work hard to earn income. And when I earn income, I would like to, I said, profit from that, right? I would like to, but when they devalue when they put my money at risk with the policies, and then they devalue my money with inflation, then quite frankly, I'm ticked off. And so those are things that's happening. So I talked about when they confiscated the gold. I think they confiscated at $25 an ounce. Please look this up. And they immediately raised it $35 an ounce. And they had a set gold price of $35 an ounce. So two things happened right there. One is that they bought the gold. When I say confiscate, they did give people $25 an ounce for their gold. But immediately after they confiscated all the gold, or after they took all the gold, they immediately set the price at $35. Well, which means that you could say they made $10 an ounce on it. On the other hand, you could say they ripped off the sellers by $10 an ounce. But what it really did, gold has been a standard. It's almost like dirt. Dirt stays the same year after year after year. The world, the geology of the earth is layer after layer after layer of stuff, and it stays the same year after year. It's constant. It's the same. And the money is what fluctuates. So relatively speaking, gold stays the same and money fluctuates. So when they did that with gold, they immediately devalued the dollar by a tremendous amount by hiking the price of gold up. Here's some quick things, facts about the U.S. debt, real quick, and I'll get back to gold and currency and the relationship there. The federal government's total debt stands at $19.845 trillion as of July 31st, and July 30th. This article was from August the 17th, 2017. So the nation's debt is now bigger than its gross domestic product, okay? That's big news. That is big stuff. 6% of the debt is owed to another arm of the federal government itself. Oh, why is that so funny? Well, the reason that is so funny is that when we buy our own debt, when we buy our own bonds, we're propping up our own bond market. And that what that means is these people, these other countries that have been buying our debt, buying those bonds, aren't so confident with the U.S. government, and they're beginning to back off. So now we're buying it ourselves. And I want to tell you what, if they're disclosing that, then the real number is much, much, much higher. The interest on the payments on the debt total $276 billion this fiscal year. Let's move on. And why do you think they want low interest rates, right? Oh my heck. Well, the last, I don't know how many minutes, didn't get recorded. So before we move on with gold and silver, or gold and its relationship to currency, I wanted to share some facts about the debt. One of them is that the more, for every percentage point of inflation that our country or the powers to be create and put into play, it costs, because of the amount of bonds and debt, we'll just call it debt, that the Chinese hold of ours, it costs them like $300 billion. So if you think that they don't want inflation, you are delusional, okay? So let's look at a couple of quick other facts about the debt. Five facts about the national debt. It is to August 17th, 2017 is when this article was written. The nation's debt is bigger than the gross national product. That's big news. That hasn't happened before, and it's not good news. It is really very, very, very bad news. Though the U.S. government debt is perhaps the most widely held class of security in the world, as of the end of July, 26.6% of the debt is owed to another arm of the federal government itself. I think that's very, very important, and the reason is that if the demand for those bonds were as great as they used to be, we probably wouldn't be buying them back ourselves. And so if we're buying them back ourselves, that's a bad sign. And what it means is we're propping up our own daggone bond market. So the net interest on our debt is 6.8% of all federal spending. In other words, $276.2 billion a year. The government wants, obviously, with all that debt, the government wants as low interest rates as they can. And they're going to continue to devalue the money for that same reason, because if they can pay back that debt with cheap money, meaning monopoly money, right? Money that has no value or a lot less value. It saves them money. And again, I referenced that Chinese thing, $300 billion, right? So recently in an interview by a guy named Greg Hunter on the alternative news media that you find on the internet, particularly YouTube, he interviewed James Rickards, the author I just spoke of. And the name of the interview is called Jim Rickards - Gold $10,000 to $50,000 per ounce. And the reason we want to look at that for a minute is that, and he references this, and I would prefer to have it in his words, but Winston Churchill, at the end, actually Great Britain, at the beginning of World War I, went off of the gold standard. And when they did, they promised the people they would go back, they would return to the gold standard when the war was over. So the war was over, and they needed to return to the gold standard. And Winston Churchill, and I think it was an economist named Keynes, and I'm not positive, but it was economists that worked in the government, and they had an argument as to where the gold price should be. And essentially, Churchill said, look, it was at, I forget what it was, $20 an ounce, I think, US dollars. $20 an ounce at the beginning of the war, we need to go back to $20 an ounce. And Keynes, if that was Keynes, but the economist said, no, we have increased the money supply by 2 times. In other words, they doubled their money supply, which means that if we go back to $20 an ounce gold, it will be deflationary. Depression, right? Deflation, depression. So he said what we need to do is we need to double the price of gold in order to absorb the currency, the larger amount of currency. So they argued about it, and everybody talked about it. And anyway, they essentially wound up going to the $20 an ounce gold. And it did cause deflation. It caused a depressionary economy in Great Britain, which many would say led to the Great Depression that the world experienced. It wasn't just the United States, it was the whole world. So let's see what he's saying here. He's talking about, he said, look, if I gave a guy, if I took two guys and gave one a ruler and one a yardstick and told them to go measure a football field, they're going to come back with essentially two different things, depending on what they're measuring with. They're going to call it two different things.
On a yardstick, and I say, tell me how long the football field is. And they come back, and the guy with the ruler says it's 300 feet, and the guy with the yardstick says it's 100 yards. So is it 300 or 100? Well, it depends on your unit of measurement. So by the same token, people say gold went up, gold it breaks out. You're going to call a dealer, and they're going to say, sorry, just like my friend in Switzerland, I can't take any more orders. I'm back ordered. You're going to call the mint. They're going to stop shipping. You're physically not going to be able to get it. You'll be sitting there watching the price go up on television, right? $100.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. That was my fault entirely.
And you're going to...
So at about 17 minutes in this, he begins to talk about why this really makes a difference, the amount of currency. And you might say, well, it doesn't matter if we don't have a gold back currency. But no matter how much the Fed or our government or the World Bank or anyone else tries to tell us that gold is not money, it's a barbaric relic, they're just wrong. If it weren't so, China and Russia and India would not be buying all of the bullion that they can get their hands on. Let me tell you what, and if they weren't selling us out, our government, they would not be suppressing gold prices so that could happen.
Now,
so,
Jim
Rickards.
There's not a central bank in the world that wants a gold standard. Not one of them. Why would they? Money is power, and they control the money, so why would they want to go to a different form of money that they don't control, specifically gold? They don't want a gold standard, but they may have to go to a gold standard. They may have no choice. It may be the only way to restore confidence. If you do, if you have a gold standard, or even if you're using gold as a reference point, you have to get the price right. See, this brings, the minute you say a gold standard, what is a gold standard? Any gold standard, what is it? Well, it's some relationship between paper money and gold. That's all. We're not going to walk around with gold coins in our pockets. I mean, having physical gold coins is a good way to preserve wealth, but in terms of transactions, we're unless there's a complete societal breakdown, which could happen, but you don't have to hypothesize that. We're not going to walk around with gold coins. We'll probably have digital money or paper money. We're mostly digital these days. But some relationship between money and gold. But you have to ask yourself a few questions. What's my definition of money? Is it M0, M1, M2? Those are very different numbers. How much gold backing do I want for my standard? Do I want 20%, 40%, 100%? Who's in this club? Is it the United States only, or do we include China, Japan, Europe, and so forth? So those are all policy questions. And I don't pretend to know the right answers. I'm just telling you the right questions. So you have to answer those to do the math. But basically, here's a big pile of gold. Here's a big pile of paper money.
So what he's saying is that if we're going to figure the real value of gold, we have to place it against the amount of currency printed in the world. So if we're going to do that, then we have to decide how much currency we bring to the table for that equation. So if we bring only U.S. dollars, then it's this. If we bring in U.S. dollars and Chinese yuan, it's this. If we bring in all the currencies of the world, or the major currencies of the world, then it's this. So that's what he's saying. And it makes perfect sense. And I think he references Churchill, but this is where that comes from.
What's that relationship? It has to be non-deflationary. If you set the price of gold in a gold standard too low, you're going to have to reduce the money supply to maintain the parity. That's going to be deflationary and depressionary. That's
what happened in the Great Depression.
That's exactly what happened in the Great Depression.
That's exactly what happened in the Great Depression.
The guy who messed it up was Winston Churchill. And the guy who told him to raise the price was John Maynard Keynes. It's kind of ironic. People think of Keynes as this gold basher. But in fact, in 1925, Winston Churchill was not prime minister. He was chancellor of the exchequer, so equivalent of our secretary of the treasury. Maynard Keynes was an advisor, Churchill wanted to go back at about $20 an ounce in dollar equivalents. And Keynes said, no, that's a mistake. You could double the money supply to fight World War I. You can't go back to the old parity. You'll have to cut the money supply in half. Keynes said you should double the price of gold, maybe to $40 an ounce. Churchill ignored it, went with the lower price that was deflationary and contributed to the Great Depression. So the monetary scholars know this. Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen won't talk about it, but they know what I'm talking about because they've studied their monetary history. So you have to have a non-deflationary price. This actually segues into the other canary, which is there's not enough gold to have a gold standard. That's pure nonsense. There's always enough gold. You just have to get the price right. Now, at $1,250 an ounce, that's way too low. I mean, that would be deflationary, depressionary. That would not work. But at $10,000 an ounce, it works fine. So all I did to get to that number, Greg, is I used M1. Okay, that's a judgment. You could have used M0 or M2. I used M1. I used 40% back.
Okay, he used 40% backing. I wanted to interrupt him there. Today's price is $1,278.50. $1,278.50 for the price of gold. $17.06 for the price of silver. We'll get into it in a minute, but holy cow. With the kind of demand that we've had, the amount of currency that's out there, these prices should not be this. And we have to, you have to ask yourself, why are these prices so low? What caused it? Is there a reason? Yeah, there's a reason. They've been depressed. They've been manipulated. But mark my word, and I watch the silver because I watch the silver. We'll let it go at that. And so silver prices will not, as long as the Federal Reserve is the entity that it is, as long as the powers to be are in place, and as long as the global elite are in control, are quasi in control, the price of silver will go not more than, I'm going to say not more than 22, but certainly not more than 25. The price will go up regardless of the demand. Regardless of demand. I believe in supply and demand. It is like gravity, and it's a solid science, or it's a solid rule of law. The more there is of something, the less value it, the less valuable it is. If there's too many billions of dollars worth of currency floating around, the dollar isn't going to be worth anything. But the same way with gold and silver. And so regardless, what I'm saying is, regardless of the demand that comes up on the for gold and silver, they meaning the global elite, the people that are in control, the powers to be, they will slam the price back down to about $15, $15, $16. It'll go up 22, maybe as much as 25, and it will be slammed probably to 15, maybe as low as 13, and it'll begin its rise again. They will slam it again, and they do it by way of paper. Gold and silver trade like maybe 100 times more than there is actually gold and silver on the market, and they do that by way of futures contracts and options and shorting gold and silver, and they provide these low prices, or they create these low prices by shorting gold and silver with monopoly money printed at the Federal Reserve, or created at the Federal Reserve, because most of our money, yourself included, myself included, I almost carry no greenbacks in my wallet ever. I use my little piece of plastic and I swipe it for everything. It's easier, it's just easier. And so I'm on digital currency regardless. So anyway, back to Jim Rickards.
Again, that's debatable. You could have used 20 or 100. I used 40. I think that's conservative. If you use Europe, China, and the U.S. using M1 with 40% backing, it's 8th grade math. The answer is $10,000 an ounce approximately. Now, what's interesting is that if you change the assumptions and you use M2 with 100% backing, I don't recommend that, but if you used M2 with 100% backing, that number is over $50,000 an ounce. So the implied non-deflationary price of gold, depending on your assumptions, is between $10,000 and $50,000 an ounce. Now, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but if you have a gold standard and you want to avoid the blunder of the 1920s, you're going to have gold at least $10,000 an ounce, possibly much higher. And again, I explain all this in my book, The New Case for Gold. The math is there, the history is there.
And I would just like to highly recommend you get The New Case for Gold. Now, or any and all of his books, they tend to overlap on the information, which is good for me because I don't retain that great. So yeah, I can highly recommend his book. I ran out of recording time, so I had to start over. But I highly recommend his books. They tend to be a little bit repetitious, which is good for a guy like me. I think most folks, I don't think we retain what we would like to believe that we retain. And the more we listen to it, the more we learn. But he goes over some of these things in a different way several times in each book. But The New Case for Gold is an excellent book. Now, if you're not going to go try to get a free Audible book and listen to it on your way to work or on your way traveling or whatever you do, while you're jogging or whatever the thing is that you do, then which is what I would recommend. But most of everything that he covers in his books, especially the important things, can be found if you just Google Jim Rickards on YouTube and you listen to each one of these interviews. So, yeah, I want to move on to another item.
One of the things that I've heard you talk about in the past is that the Fed wants inflation. And last week, Janet Yellen spoke, and I don't know, maybe you can understand her. I mean, she's goofy. It just sounds like she's not going to raise rates. They want inflation. Some of the Fed governors out saying, we need to hit our 2% inflation target. Am I getting this wrong? Does the Fed want inflation? You have brought that up before, that the Fed wants inflation. They're going to get inflation. Will you explain that?
Well, first of all, the Fed absolutely wants inflation. Now, they have an inflation target of 2%. This is no secret. It's in every speech, every press conference, every Fed statement. It's enshrined as official policy. They want 2% inflation. Now, it's kind of interesting why that's the goal. Why not zero? I mean, it seems to me you should want zero inflation. No inflation, no deflation. That's price stability. So then people can make investment decisions or hiring decisions or other decisions without having to take into account whether money is worth more or less. You have a constant money, and then you make your decisions based on your business prospects or other financial or economic conditions. But that's not what the Fed does. They don't target zero. They target 2%. Now, it sounds more what's wrong with 2%? We've seen worse. In 1980, we had 15% inflation. Between 1977 and 1981, in a 5-year period, cumulative inflation was 50%, 50. The value of the dollar was cut in half in 5 years between 77 and 81. So that's pretty nasty. So 2% sounds benign, but again, let's do the math, Greg. 2% inflation cuts the...
Did you hear that? In the 70s, over a 5-year period of time, we had a cumulative 50% inflation. Now, I want you to take this personally, because inflation isn't just a number. It isn't just higher prices. It is robbing from the people. It is robbing from you. They have essentially, over the last 30 or so years, wiped out the middle class. It almost does not exist. It almost does not exist. I want you to think about this for a minute. Back in that day, the percentage of working moms was much, much, much lower. I don't know what the percentage was, but it was much lower than it is now. So now the percentage of working moms is almost 100%. I mean, it essentially is 100%. And now don't get me wrong, my girls are brilliant girls, and I want them to exercise their brain, their brilliance, and meet their potential. I want that. I have 3 little girls. Well, they're all adult. They're adult women with babies of their own. But I want that. But from an economic standpoint, I'm just talking about the way it was and the way it is. And so right now, it takes both incomes to create the same amount of income or the same amount of purchasing power that we had back when they were being reared on one income. That's how much change there is already. They are robbing the wealth of our nation from the people with inflation. Take this personally. Take it as personal as a robber at your front door with a gun taking your stuff, because that's what they're doing. They're taking your stuff.
Value of the dollar in half in 35 years. Go another 35 years, it's half again. So you cut something in half, take the half that's left, cut it in half again, you've got 1/4 left, which means that 35 plus 35 is 70 years, right? So in an average lifetime of 70 years from birth to death, the value of the dollar drops 75%. A dollar is only worth 25%, 25 cents on the dollar compared to when you were born. That's with 2% inflation. 2% inflation cuts the value of the dollar 75% in an average lifetime. You get into 3% inflation or 4% inflation, now you're talking about wiping out the value of the dollar in the course of an average lifetime. So what's so benign about destroying the currency by 75% in an average lifetime? That's what 2% inflation does. But the Fed's logic is, well, you know what? I analogize it to a little kid. You know, he looks in his mom's wallet, and, you know, 9-year-old kid looks in his mom's wallet and he sees $100. And he says, well, if I take the $100, mom will know and I'll be in trouble. But if I take $2, she won't miss it. You know, in other words, 2%, they're not getting it because velocity is declining, but they have to. I explain why.
So yeah, that's very true. What he's getting ready to talk about is, I think, the velocity of money. So in the 70s, well, maybe before that, but particularly in the 70s, we began throwing debt into the economy to pump it up. And so it used to be for every dollar's worth of debt that we threw into the economy, we got $1 worth of pump out of it. So you throw $1 worth of debt money into the economy, and I guess it translated to gross national product. But we don't get that now. Now it takes $3. This is too insane to not be real. But I mean, you couldn't have wrote a science fiction book that was more insane. But now we throw $3 worth of debt money at the economy for every $1 that we get bang out of it. It's insanity.
That is their target. Now, what's interesting, we're in an era of what I call, we actually have an increase in our standard of living. We're making gold, physical gold that you control, not in the banks, either, private pizza parlor, dry cleaner, an auto
Terribly
dealer,
sorry about that.
lawyer, dentist. Put it to one side. The Fed's logic is, well, you know what? I analogize it to a little kid. You know, he looks.
Okay, we already had that.
Era of what I call Mick Jagger economics. You know, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones had a song called "You Can't Always Get What You Want." The Fed wants 2% inflation, but they haven't been able to get it for the last 8 years. Briefly they did, but on average over 8 years, we're nowhere near 2% inflation. In fact, some evidence that we're bordering on deflation. And in fact, in Europe and Japan and elsewhere, they actually have deflation. So, but governments cannot tolerate deflation. Governments cannot have deflation because it increases the real value of debt, increases the debt to GDP ratio, destroys tax collections. Because, you know, if you and I make a certain amount of money one year and we make the same amount of money the next year, but prices go down, we actually have an increase in our standard of living. We're making the same amount of money, but if all the prices went down, we can afford more dinners and more gas in the car or whatever. So we have an increase in standard of living. If you and I get a
But
raise,
they can't tax us.
what does the government do? They tax us. But if you and I get an increase in our standard of living from lower prices, the government hasn't figured out how to tax that. They don't know how to tax the benefits of deflation to consumers. So the government hates deflation because they can't tax it. They hate it because it messes up their debt to GDP ratios. They must have inflation. So we have a situation where the Fed wants inflation. I explain why. They're not getting it because velocity is declining, but they have to have it. So what does that mean for policy? It means they're not going to give up. They're going to keep trying. So whether it's QE4, negative interest rates, forward guidance, Operation Twist, currency wars, take your pick. These are all the tools in the toolkit. You know, it's like a hammer, a saw, a level, and a plane. You know, these are the carpenter's tools. They're going to keep trying until they get this inflation. And when that happens, you're going to wish you had your gold.
One last question, just for people saying, what should I do? I know you're recommending 10 to 20% of physical gold in your position. And
Through the 1920s.
Okay, so he does recommend 10% of. He eats, lives, and breathes gold, and we can learn a lot from him. I'm not sure we need to be just exactly like him, but we need to learn a lot from him. And the reason he recommends 10% of all of your investable assets, I'm kind of weird. I think all of your asset values, and if the earlier you're started in life, the more you can achieve that goal. But he says 10% of your assets in gold. And when he says gold, I say gold and silver. In fact, I like silver better than gold, and we'll get into that later, but silver is better than gold based on my research. But he says, and he, at one point he says gold and silver, but he's really a gold freak, and I am a silver freak. But the reason he says 10% in gold and silver is because he believes there'll be a 90% drawback, and I do too. And with the inflation, we look at the inflated dollar, and we look at the Federal Reserve's desire and need to prop up the fallacy that all is well and good in the land of Oz. They actually operate and he talks about it in his book. He talks about it in this particular interview also. But they operate what he calls it a trading desk, but it's not a trading one desk. It's a trading group. It's a trading floor, kind of like at Wall Street. But the Federal Reserve operates a trading group, or employs a trading group, has a trading group in their building, in their group, that shorts gold and silver to keep the gold and silver prices low. So let's not call it that. We're going to call it manipulate. So they manipulate it with futures markets. And again, when you print money out of thin air, it doesn't matter how much money you spend on it, does it? So manipulating the markets, those markets, with monopoly money, and throwing paper futures at gold and silver. In this case, they short it, saying, I'm betting that it will be a low price. However, when it comes to the stocks and bonds markets, they do whatever they want to do to continue to prop things up and to create, to not just create, but continue the illusion. And so they're into equities, that is the stock market, they're into bond market, they're into all of the commodities markets, particularly strategic commodities like oil. And so nothing is as it seems. The global elitists, the Federal Reserve, and the other central banks that are in collusion with each other, are manipulating all of these prices so that the sheep don't realize that we are really at the cusp of a serious problem. And we are in the middle of a serious problem. And when you look at the value of our dollar, where it's gone, where the value where it was, where it is now, how quickly it has happened in my lifetime, what it's done to the people in my generation. And again, remember, this video is a friends and family video. So the people that I'm most concerned about studying this and learning more about this, and it's not watch Dad's video, watch Greg's video. I want the video to spark your interest so that you pull out your phone or your laptop and you research this stuff for yourself. I absolutely do not want you to take my word for anything. What I want you to do is research yourself and begin to not follow the herd of sheep and begin to see what's really going on around us. But when we look at where the dollar has come from, where it has gone, where it is now, and what predicament the dollar is in, and the forces around when it comes to trade and not using the dollar, the U.S. dollar, as the world trade currency, and how that the other countries are buying more and more gold because I believe, and I think there's evidence that points to a gold-backed monetary standard throughout the world. And so I think that rather than let things just keep our head in the sand and let our wealth or the things that we've worked for turn into dust or smoke, our money turn into smoke, I think that it's very, very important that we begin thinking a little I hate to say outside the box, but just quit thinking like the herd of sheep. And we're being led, literally led to the slaughter financially. Because, Greg, that sounds crazy. You're being fanatical. No, I'm not being fanatical. They will, the one thing, we talk about risk in finance and we risk in investments. The greatest, it's beyond risk. The greatest sure thing that you can count on right now is they will devalue your dollar. And your dollar will be worth less next year than it's worth this year. It is continually worth less than it is. And that's a given. You can count on that. They promise you. It is a given. So, yeah, we need to be looking toward gold and silver. And in my case, I love silver. And I love silver for a number of reasons. We'll get into it in a minute, or I hope I don't have to bust up these videos because I hope I can learn how to thread them together. But at any rate, gold. Oh, why gold? So the reason why gold is that not because it's going to go up in value to make gains necessarily, but because if everything else retracts 90%, right? Stocks, bonds go to pot. The experts that study the economy are, in fact, Jim Rickards is one of them, that most real estate will retract about 8%. So whatever it's worth now, it'll be worth about 20%. I built a beautiful home for my children and my wife, or actually for Carolyn, my wife. So we need to wrap up the first video in a series of videos. Of course, I think we labeled it Bitcoin, gold, silver, and fiat currency. And so what we've tried to do is cover the fiat currency side of things and why I've been led to the way I believe about things and the history of this fiat currency thing. There's so much more that we could go into that I really want you to do your research on. By all means, please, those sites and authors and books that I've referenced, we need to read those. I really want you to read them. And I want you to do your own research. I want you to gain those that information for yourself and own that information. I've cited several authors and books. The Creature from the Island and the Jim Rickards books. There's actually more than I mentioned. And the one I did not mention is The New Case for Gold. And then as we looked at each screenshot behind me, I hope that references those enough so that you can find them yourself. If you have any trouble, let me know, and I'll send you the link or tell you where it is. But to wrap up that video, this video, I think what we need to do is just simply say that there's a reason that our currency is going down in value. There's a reason that the inflation exists, and the reason that the Federal Reserve and the powers to be want inflation. And I think it's important that we not have our heads in the sand and be led by a group of sheep. And so there are alternatives out there. There's the alternative of gold, and it has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. I don't know what its real timetable is. The same way with silver. It has mostly advantages. It may have a few disadvantages. And I don't know its timetable because there's still so much manipulation in both gold and silver. The fiat currency thing, it just sucks. I wish it weren't so, but it sucks. It's going to suck worse and worse and worse, and it's going to become worth less and less and less. I encourage you to look up on the internet the devaluation of money, the history of collapsing currencies and things of that nature. There are plenty of people who have watched their currencies completely devalue to nothing, and where they've had to carry wheelbarrows full of their currency to the baker to buy a loaf of bread, because at one time it was worth a lot of money and then it wasn't. So, and right now Venezuela is experiencing those same things, and most of the Soviet bloc countries have already experienced those things. And so to some extent, most of the currencies, if not all of the major currencies, have been overinflated and over-created or printed, if you will. And it's like a freight train headed toward a brick wall or something, and it's going to hit at some point. So I think we need to look at what the alternatives are, and there's many alternatives, I'm sure, or I would think there's many alternatives, but this is an alternative that I've stumbled across. And so I want to lay the foundation as to why Bitcoin and why not other things at this moment. And that moment will change, and the pendulum will swing toward other things in due time. Greg Zellers signing out.